A girl saved her grandmother from being killed, and then her life changed forever. The city always wore its gray like a familiar coat, worn, frayed but reliable. Narrow alleys curved like secrets through the old town, and people moved about with tired steps and quiet hopes. Among them lived a girl named Alice. She was just 20, but already she had known the kind of hardship that aged a person in ways not visible to the eye. Alice lived alone in a tiny rented room above a bakery, where the smell of bread teased her more often than it fed her. Her clothes were mended by her own careful hand, her shoes scuffed from long walks, and her dreams, well, they were hidden beneath layers of reality she dared not peel back too often. But Alice had something that no one could take from her, a kind heart and the courage to act when others would hesitate. That day, the sky was a dull silver, and a breeze tugged playfully at the ends of her simple dress as she wandered along the edge of the great river that split the city. She liked coming here when the world felt too heavy. The water spoke to her in ripples and waves, and the trees that lined the banks swayed like quiet sentinels. She was alone, her thoughts drifting, when a strange sound broke the peace. At first, it was only a splash, loud, unnatural. Then came the unmistakable cry, faint, panicked, pleading. Alice ran toward the sound, her feet slipping slightly on the damp grass. Her eyes scanned the water, and then she saw her. An elderly woman, maybe in her 70s, was caught in the river. Her arms flailed weakly, her mouth gasping for air between coughs. The current dragged her mercilessly, threatening to pull her under at any moment. Alice didn't stop to think. She kicked off her shoes, tore off the shawl that clung to her shoulders, and plunged into the river. The cold hit her like a slap. Her breath seized in her chest, but she fought through it, swimming with fierce determination. The river was stronger than she had anticipated, its current tugging at her limbs and pushing her off course. But she fixed her eyes on the woman and kept going. She reached her just as the woman's strength gave out. Wrapping one arm tightly around her frail frame, Alice began the agonizing swim back to shore. Every stroke felt like a battle. Her muscles burned. The water fought her. But Alice gritted her teeth, focused on the shoreline, and refused to let go. When they were close enough to feel the muddy bottom beneath their feet, Alice pushed the woman up onto the bank with the last of her strength. The woman coughed violently, spitting out water and shivering uncontrollably. Alice tried to pull herself up after her, but then it happened. A sudden surge of water came from upstream, the kind of silent monster that rivers sometimes kept hidden until just the right moment. It grabbed Alice's legs and dragged her back into the middle of the current before she could resist. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the wind. The old woman cried out in horror, crawling on her hands and knees toward the water, reaching helplessly toward the girl who had just saved her life. "Alice," she called, though she did not yet know her name. "No! Someone help! Please! She's still out there!" Her voice cracked with despair. And then, footsteps. A man appeared, running toward the scene, his expensive coat flying behind him, his expression twisted with fear. He dropped to his knees beside the old woman. "Mother," he said, his voice rough, "are you all right? What happened?" The woman clutched at his arms, eyes wide with urgency. "She saved me, Robert," she gasped. "That girl. She jumped in to save me, and now the river has her. Go! Please, go after her." Robert didn't hesitate. Without a word, he threw off his coat and boots and dove into the river. He was younger than he looked in the newspapers, broad-shouldered, with a swimmer's build and the sharp focus of someone used to making fast decisions. He had grown up on these riverbanks, once upon a time, long before money had drawn him into its glittering world. Now he swam with the kind of desperation that could only come from fear. Fear that he was already too late. But then he saw her. Alice was floating just above the surface, barely conscious, the current pulling her further downstream. Her arms moved sluggishly, and her face was pale with exhaustion. Robert pushed harder. The distance between them closed, and he grabbed her just as her head began to dip under again. He pulled her against his chest and began the long, brutal swim back to shore. The river did not make it easy. It pulled at them both, biting at his strength with icy teeth. But Robert fought harder. Minutes later, they reached the shore. Alice was limp in his arms as he carried her to dry ground. The old woman cried out with relief as Robert gently laid Alice down in the grass. "Call an ambulance!" he shouted to a nearby fisherman who had stopped at the sound of screaming. "Now!" The fisherman nodded and ran toward his boat, where a radio waited. Robert turned back to Alice. She was breathing, but faintly. Her skin was cold, her fingers twitching slightly. He tore off his shirt and wrapped it around her, rubbing her arms, trying to keep her warm. "Stay with me," he murmured. "You're going to be all right. Just stay with me." His mother knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she touched Alice's damp hair. "She's an angel," she whispered. "I owe her my life." Robert looked at the girl before him, her lashes dark against her pale cheeks, and something stirred deep in his chest. He didn't know her name, but already she felt like someone who mattered. The ambulance arrived minutes later. As paramedics lifted Alice onto a stretcher and took her away, Robert went with them, never once letting go of her hand. And so, the river that had nearly taken a life became the unlikely beginning of something much greater. A story of courage, rescue, and hearts that had yet to discover the love waiting just ahead. The sirens wailed through the dusk, slicing through the air like the cry of fate itself. Inside the ambulance, the air was tense, filled with the rhythmic beeping of machines, the crackle of the radio, and the quiet commands of the paramedics. But to Robert, everything was a blur. Everything but the unconscious girl lying beside him. Alice was pale, her skin drained of color, her damp hair plastered to her forehead. An oxygen mask covered the lower half of her face, and her breaths came in slow, measured intervals. Robert sat at her side, his large hand gently cradling hers. His fingers, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he held on to her as if afraid that letting go would mean losing her forever. He didn't know her story, didn't know her name, her life, her dreams. All he knew was that she had risked everything to save his mother. A stranger. A girl who had nothing to gain. And that kind of bravery, it was something rare, precious, sacred. He leaned forward, speaking softly as the ambulance raced through the streets. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I promise you, I won't let anything happen to you." The hospital loomed ahead, sterile and white against the deepening night. Nurses and doctors were waiting at the emergency entrance, and as soon as the vehicle stopped, the doors were flung open and Alice was wheeled out with practiced urgency. Robert followed, his expensive shoes soaked and forgotten, his designer coat left behind on the riverbank. He didn't care. Inside, the medical staff moved quickly. Vitals were checked, wet clothing was removed, warm blankets wrapped around her, and heated IV fluids were administered. The doctor, a woman in her 40s with a calm voice and firm gaze, turned to Robert. "Are you family?" she asked. Robert hesitated. "No, but I need to stay." The doctor seemed to consider him for a moment before nodding. "She's hypothermic and exhausted, but she's young and strong. With rest, she should recover." Those words lifted a weight off his shoulders he hadn't realized was there. Still, he remained outside the room for hours, watching through the glass as nurses checked on her, listening to the soft hum of machines and the ticking clock on the wall. He called his driver and assistant only once, to cancel his meetings and bring dry clothes, but beyond that he didn't move. And slowly the hospital quieted. By midnight the halls were hushed, the lights dimmed, and only a few night nurses passed now and then. Robert sat in a stiff plastic chair, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor, lost in thought. He had everything, at least by the world's standards: wealth, power, a name that opened doors. But in all the parties and meetings and private jets, he couldn't remember the last time someone had done something selfless in his world. The last time he had seen that kind of purity, that kind of raw courage. And then, movement. He looked up, eyes widening as he saw her stir beneath the blankets. Her fingers twitched, her lips parted, and a soft, hoarse breath escaped her mouth. Then her eyes opened. At first they were unfocused, glassy. Then they blinked, slowly adjusting to the light. She turned her head slightly, and her gaze landed on him, uncertain, weak, but aware. Robert rose instantly, coming to the side of her bed. "Hey," he said gently, crouching to her level. "You're awake. You're safe now." Alice frowned faintly, confusion knitting her brow. "Where?" "You're in the hospital. You were in the river. You saved my mother." Her brows furrowed deeper. "Your mother?" "She fell in. You pulled her out, but the current took you. I found you downstream. You almost didn't make it." Alice tried to sit up, wincing. He reached forward, steadying her with a hand behind her back. "Easy. Don't push yourself." She relaxed slightly, breathing carefully, her eyes watching him now with a little more focus. "I remember the river," she murmured. "She was drowning." "You saved her," Robert said softly. "You didn't even hesitate. You risked your life for her." Alice said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Is she all right?" He smiled. "She's fine. A little shaken, but unharmed. She's staying at my house tonight. She wanted to come see you, but I told her to rest first." Alice nodded slowly, then her eyes drifted over the room, the clean walls, the machines, the IV in her arm. I don't have insurance," she said suddenly, her voice tight with worry. "I can't pay for this." Robert reached out and gently touched her hand again. "Don't worry about that," he said. "Everything's taken care of. I made sure of it." She looked at him, stunned. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated. "Because you matter," he said simply. "Because people like you deserve the world. And because you saved the person I love most." Silence stretched between them for a moment, heavy but not uncomfortable. Then he added with a faint smile, "Besides, I'm Robert Whitmore." Alice blinked. The name sounded familiar. Then her eyes widened. "Wait, the Robert Whitmore? The tech company?" He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's me." She stared at him, astonished. "You're a millionaire." "I suppose so," he said modestly. "But right now, I'm just the son of the woman you saved, and the man who owes you more than words can express." Her cheeks flushed, her lips pressing together. Then she laughed, quietly but genuinely. "Well," she said softly, "this has been a strange day." Robert laughed too, the sound warm and unguarded. "I'd say it's just beginning." They sat in comfortable silence for a while after that. Outside, the city slept, unaware that within the hospital's quiet walls a connection had begun, tentative, unexpected, and destined to grow. And as Alice drifted back into a peaceful sleep, Robert remained at her side, watching over her like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Morning light spilled through the tall hospital windows, soft and golden, warming the sterile white walls with a gentle glow. Birds sang somewhere outside, their voices weaving through the quiet hallways and into the room where Alice lay resting. She stirred slightly beneath the blankets, eyelids fluttering open as the familiar ache in her muscles reminded her that what had happened the day before had not been a dream. She was alive. The soft murmur of voices reached her ears, and as she turned her head toward the sound, she saw him. Robert. He stood near the doorway, speaking in low tones to a nurse, his posture relaxed but alert, as though he had not left her side for long. When he noticed she was awake, he smiled and approached the bed. "Good morning," he said warmly. "How are you feeling?" Alice offered a small smile in return. "Better, I think. Still tired." "You've been through a lot. It's okay to rest." She looked around the room, then back at him. "You stayed?" He shrugged lightly, but there was something genuine in his voice. "I didn't want to leave you alone." Alice blinked, touched by the sincerity behind those words. It had been a long time since anyone had made her feel like she wasn't facing the world by herself. Before she could reply, there was a soft knock at the door. Robert turned. A woman entered, elegant despite her age, dressed in a warm coat with a silk scarf at her neck. Her silver hair had been brushed neatly, and though she still moved slowly, there was strength in the way she held herself. Alice's eyes widened with recognition. "You?" The woman smiled, eyes bright with emotion. "Yes, my dear. I'm the woman you saved. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and you must be Alice." Alice looked at Robert, who nodded. "My mother." Eleanor moved closer and gently took Alice's hand in both of hers. "I owe you my life," she said with quiet intensity. "There are no words for what you did. I was drowning, and no one else came. You didn't know me, but you didn't hesitate. You're the reason I'm here." Alice felt a lump rise in her throat. "I couldn't just stand there." "That's what makes you special," Eleanor said softly. "Most people would have waited, called for help, frozen, but not you." Alice blushed under the praise, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, much less the recipient of such sincere gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. Eleanor nodded, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Then, after a pause, she looked at her son and then back at Alice. "I was hoping," she began slowly, "that once you're well enough, you might consider joining us for a little while. At our home." Alice blinked. "Your home?" Robert stepped in gently. "Just until you're fully recovered. It's a peaceful place, and we have everything you'll need. Doctors, food, comfort. You won't have to worry about anything." Alice hesitated. The idea felt surreal. She was used to scraping by, to living with little and asking for nothing. Being invited into the home of one of the wealthiest families in the city was not something she had ever imagined. I don't want to intrude." "You wouldn't be," Eleanor said firmly. "You'd be a guest. No, more than that, a friend, family, if you'll have us." Something in Eleanor's eyes reminded Alice of the grandmother she had once known, that same warmth, that same unwavering honesty. After a moment's silence, Alice nodded. "All right, just for a little while." Robert's smile widened with quiet relief. "Good." The next 2 days passed quickly. The doctors cleared Alice for release, satisfied with her recovery and strength. She was still tired, her body sore from the ordeal, but the warmth of genuine care and the presence of people who treated her with kindness made the pain easier to bear. When the day came for her to leave the hospital, She stood nervously in borrowed clothes, clutching the strap of a small tote bag containing her few belongings. Robert waited by the exit, and when he saw her, his expression softened. "You ready?" Alice nodded. "I think so." The ride to the Whitmore estate was silent at first. Alice sat in the back seat of the sleek black car, watching the city fade into the distance, replaced by green hills and tall trees. She had never left the city before. Her world had been small. Tight apartments, crowded sidewalks, second-hand stores. This was something else entirely. When the car turned down a long, tree-lined driveway, Alice sat up straighter, her breath catching in her throat. The house, no, the mansion, stood proudly on a hill, its stone facade glowing in the afternoon sun. Tall windows framed with ivy, wide balconies, and gardens that stretched in every direction. It looked like something out of a book, something unreachable. Robert helped her out of the car. "I know, it's a lot," he said quietly, "but it's just a house, Alice. What matters is the people inside it." She nodded slowly, letting him guide her up the steps and through the grand front doors. Inside, the space was warm and filled with light. The smell of fresh flowers and wood polish lingered in the air. Eleanor greeted her at the door, arms outstretched. "Welcome, dear." That first evening passed like a dream. A guest room had been prepared just for her. Sunlight streamed through the windows and soft blankets lined the bed. Eleanor insisted that Alice rest, but also encouraged her to explore, to feel at home. Over the following days, Alice found herself growing more comfortable. She wandered the gardens, walked the forest trails, and spent long afternoons in the quiet library. Eleanor often joined her, sharing stories from her youth or simply enjoying the silence together. And Robert, he was always near. He never pushed, never demanded her attention, but he was present. He joined her for tea, asked about her childhood, told her stories from his world of business and travel. They laughed often, and sometimes in the quiet moments their eyes would meet and linger just a second too long. Alice had never known such peace. But in the back of her mind, a question waited. Why were they being so kind? What did they truly want? That question found its answer one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of lavender and gold. Eleanor and Robert sat with Alice on the veranda, the scent of roses drifting on the breeze. Eleanor reached over and took Alice's hand. "My dear," she said gently, "I've come to care for you as if you were my own daughter. And I know my son feels something too. He may be too proud to say it yet, but I see it, and I think you see it too." Alice looked away, her heart thudding. "I'm just me," she whispered. "Poor, ordinary. This world isn't mine." Robert leaned forward, his voice low and sincere. "Alice, you saved a life. You changed ours. That's not ordinary, and I don't care about money or background or what society thinks. I care about you." Silence fell over them, heavy with truth. Then Eleanor said the words that would echo into the future. "I would be honored, truly honored, if you and my son chose to build a life together." Alice froze, her breath caught in her throat. Was this real? Robert reached for her hand. "It doesn't have to be today, or tomorrow, but I want to know if you'll let me try, to know you, to love you, to make you happy." And in the deepening dusk, with the wind whispering through the trees and her heart pounding with fear and hope, Alice gave the only answer she could. The days that followed unfolded with a gentleness that Alice had never experienced before. In the past, her life had moved to the rhythm of necessity, of early mornings and long hours, of watching coins vanish too quickly, of quiet prayers spoken to the ceiling before sleep. But here, in the Whitmore estate, time felt different. Love, when it arrives unannounced, can be like spring after a long winter, hesitant at first, then suddenly everywhere, blooming in every quiet moment. For Alice and Robert, the weeks that followed were filled with discoveries, not of extravagant things, but of small, sacred ones. How he liked his coffee just barely sweet, how she hummed while she brushed her hair, how his hand found hers without needing to look, and how her laughter changed the air in a room. They spent their mornings walking through the gardens, sometimes in conversation, sometimes in companionable silence. In the afternoons, Robert would show her the different rooms of the estate, his library with shelves that reached the ceiling, the sunroom where his mother painted delicate watercolors, the old stable where horses once lived, but now served as a quiet place for reading. Each part of his world became a little more hers. But love, like any great thing, comes with shadows too. Alice often found herself waking in the early hours of the morning, thoughts swirling like smoke, thoughts of her past, of the poverty she had left behind but not forgotten, of whether this life was really hers or just a dream borrowed from someone else's fairy tale. She had spent her entire life surviving, and now, faced with the prospect of happiness, a strange fear crept into her heart. What if it didn't last? One evening, while Robert was away on a call with his business partners, Alice stood in front of a tall mirror in the guest room that had now become her room. She studied her reflection, her simple cotton dress, her worn shoes, her calloused hands. She still felt like a visitor in this world of silk and chandeliers, no matter how kindly she was treated. When Robert returned, he found her standing at the window, her shoulders tense. He approached quietly. "Penny, for your thoughts?" She didn't turn around. "Do you ever think all of this, might be too much?" He was quiet for a moment, then stepped beside her. "For you? For me? For us?" Robert took her hand. "Alice, love doesn't measure worth by bank accounts or last names. It sees the heart, and yours is the most beautiful I've ever known." She finally looked up at him, her eyes brimming. "But people will talk. About me, about how I don't belong." He shook his head gently. "Let them. What matters is what we build together, not what they say." She exhaled slowly, leaning into his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, steady as stone. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered. "You won't," he murmured. "Not now, not ever." In the following days, Robert began to introduce her slowly to parts of his public life. They attended a charity gala hosted at the estate, where Alice, in a simple but elegant gown chosen by Eleanor, stood beside Robert with grace. The guests, while curious, were respectful, most too taken with her quiet dignity to whisper anything unkind. One guest, an older woman in glittering jewels, leaned into Eleanor at one point and whispered, "She carries herself like a queen." Eleanor only smiled. "She's already more noble than most I've met." As summer deepened, Robert and Alice began to speak in more certain terms about the future. There was no grand proposal, no public spectacle. One morning, over breakfast in the garden, Robert simply reached across the table and took her hand. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as a guest, not as someone passing through. I want you here, with me, as my partner, as my wife." Alice's eyes filled, but her voice was steady. "Yes." The days that followed were a blur of quiet preparations. They didn't want a lavish wedding. Eleanor, understanding her son and Alice completely, arranged for a small ceremony on the estate grounds, beneath the great willow tree that had stood for generations. Only a handful of guests were invited, close friends, loyal staff, and a few of Robert's oldest associates. On the morning of the wedding, the sky was blue and clear, the air filled with the scent of roses and fresh grass. Alice stood before the mirror in a gown of soft ivory silk, her hair loose in waves, a crown of wildflowers on her head. Eleanor stood behind her, fastening a delicate pendant around her neck. "This belonged to Robert's grandmother," she said. "She would have loved you." Alice turned, her voice shaking. "Thank you for everything." Eleanor kissed her forehead. "You were a gift we never saw coming." Robert stood under the willow in a charcoal suit, his hands clasped in front of him, eyes fixed on the path where she would appear. When he saw her, his breath caught. Not because she looked beautiful, though she did, but because she looked happy. Radiantly, peacefully happy. They spoke their vows quietly, words full of truth and emotion witnessed by trees, birdsong, and the people who mattered. When Robert kissed her, there were tears in many eyes, not from spectacle, but from the sense that something rare and good had taken root in the world. Later, as the sun set and soft music played in the background, Robert pulled Alice into a quiet dance beneath the fairy lights strung through the trees. She rested her head against his shoulder, and they swayed slowly, hearts aligned. "Mrs. Whitmore," he whispered. She smiled, "Still getting used to that." "You'll have time," he said, kissing her temple. They didn't talk about the river that night, but both of them felt it, the strange winding path that had brought them together. From rushing water and trembling hands to vows spoken in sunlight, their journey had been unexpected, but that, perhaps, was the best kind. And, as the stars appeared one by one, Alice whispered to herself, too softly for anyone else to hear, "I was never meant to be ordinary." The wedding had come and gone like a dream, a golden blur of sunlight, promises, and delicate laughter carried on the summer wind. But marriage, Alice quickly learned, was not the end of the story. It was a beginning, and beginnings, even the most beautiful ones, came with their own challenges and quiet revelations. Life with Robert was gentle, steady. He was attentive, thoughtful, never too far from her side. But now that they were bound by vows, the rhythm of their days subtly shifted. No longer simply guests in each other's lives, they were now building something together. Shared mornings, shared decisions, shared responsibilities. There was comfort in it, but also a deep sense of responsibility, like tending a fragile garden that needed daily care. Their days were simple, but rich. They took breakfast on the terrace whenever the weather allowed, talking about books or ideas or things they had never had the time to speak of before. Robert resumed some of his business obligations, but he did so with a new lightness in his step. Alice often accompanied him into the city for meetings or charity events, standing quietly beside him observing the world she had once only glimpsed from the outside. At first, she had felt out of place, surrounded by polished people in tailored suits, glistening rooms full of quiet power. But Robert always introduced her with the same steady pride. "My wife, Alice." And in time, she grew more confident, not by pretending to be someone she wasn't, but by standing firmly in who she was. Her grace was not the result of breeding or etiquette lessons. It came from having known hardship and choosing kindness anyway. Still, not everyone welcomed her. There were whispers, occasionally, in corners of receptions, disbelieving glances from old family friends, polite questions with sharp edges. "And where did you say you studied, dear? What does your family do?" Such an unusual match, isn't it? But Alice weathered them all with quiet dignity. She had no shame in her past, and whenever she began to feel the sting of judgment, she would remember Robert's hand at the small of her back, grounding her, or Eleanor's kind eyes watching protectively from across the room. One autumn afternoon, as leaves blushed gold and orange across the estate grounds, Alice sat with Eleanor in the library. A fire crackled nearby, and sunlight poured through the tall windows. "You've taken to this life with grace," Eleanor said, sipping her tea. "But I wonder, are you happy, truly?" Alice looked into the fire for a long moment. "I am," she said, "but sometimes I still feel like I'm borrowing someone else's life, like I might wake up and it will all be gone." Eleanor reached over and took her hand. "It's not borrowed, dear. It's earned, not by wealth or status, but by the strength of your heart. You belong here, not because of where you came from, but because of who you are." Alice smiled, blinking away tears. In their private world, Alice and Robert found joy in simple things: quiet dinners cooked together, long walks after rain, evenings spent reading side by side with a soft blanket stretched across both their laps. They laughed often, argued rarely, and when they did, it was with tenderness, never cruelty. But life, as always, had its storms. One winter, Robert faced a difficult season in his company. A major investment failed. Several partners withdrew. For weeks, he returned home late, shadows under his eyes, his phone buzzing with urgent messages at all hours. Alice supported him as best she could, bringing tea, offering calm words, giving him space when needed. But one night, she found him in the study with his head in his hands, the weight of it all pressing down. "I've built so much," he murmured, "and it can all vanish overnight." She knelt beside him, placing a hand on his knee. "Then let it," she said gently. "Let it vanish if it must. I didn't marry a fortune, Robert. I married you." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw not just his wife but the woman who had once dived into a river without hesitation to save a stranger. The woman who had never asked for riches, only honesty. The woman whose love didn't depend on whether the world called him powerful or not. "I don't want to lose this," he said. "You won't," she whispered. "Not if we face it together." And they did. With Alice's quiet strength behind him, Robert made bold choices, streamlining the company, cutting losses, rebuilding. It took months, but the storm passed. He emerged from it not just intact, but transformed. And he often said, to anyone who asked, that he owed his resilience to her. As spring returned to the land, so too did a renewed joy in their home. Eleanor's health remained strong, and she continued her painting with renewed vigor, often presenting Alice with small watercolor gifts: roses, rivers, stars. "Little pieces of your story," she would say. One day, as Alice and Robert sat beneath the great willow tree that had witnessed their vows, he turned to her with a thoughtful look. "Do you ever think about what's next?" he asked. She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "Family," he said quietly. "Children. A life that stretches beyond just us." Alice was quiet for a long time. "Yes," she said finally. "I do. I think about it all the time." He smiled and laced his fingers with hers. "We've built something strong. I'd be honored to grow it with you." Her heart swelled with a quiet, profound joy. "I'd like that very much." In the distance, the river glinted in the light, a winding silver ribbon that reminded them both of how far they had come. From a moment of danger to a lifetime of safety, from strangers to soulmates, their love had not just survived, it had flourished. And as birds flew overhead and the willow swayed in the breeze, Alice leaned into Robert and closed her eyes, already seeing the shape of the life they would continue to build, together. Time moved gently in the world Alice and Robert had built. Years had passed since the river's cold grasp tried to take her life. Seasons rolled over the estate like soft waves, green spring into golden summer, russet autumn into silent winter, then back again. The trees grew taller, the gardens more lush, and within the old stone walls of the Whitmore estate, a new kind of life had taken root. Alice stood at the window of the nursery, gazing out over the garden paths. The wind carried the scent of blooming lilacs and freshly turned earth. In her arms, she cradled her daughter, only a few months old, swaddled in soft cotton, her tiny chest rising and falling in rhythmic slumber. They had named her Clara. The name had come to Alice on a quiet morning, as she sat beneath the willow tree, feeling the life stir within her for the first time. Clara meant bright or clear, and to Alice she represented everything that had once felt distant and impossible. Love, safety, a future. Robert entered the room softly, pausing to watch his wife and daughter framed in the golden light. His heart, so often entangled in the practicalities of business and responsibility, always softened at this sight. "You two are the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice quiet. Alice smiled, turning to him. She just fell asleep. He crossed the room and placed a kiss on his wife's temple before brushing a gentle hand across Clara's tiny head. Then he slid an arm around Alice's waist and stood there with her, both of them watching the sun rise over the land that had become their sanctuary. There was peace in their life, not from a lack of trouble, but from a deep knowing that they would weather anything together. Their home was filled with laughter now, with the quiet patter of little feet, the occasional cries of wakeful nights, and the joy of watching something new unfold each day. Eleanor, growing older but still full of wit and strength, doted on Clara with devotion. She painted her sleeping face a dozen times, each canvas softer and more tender than the last. Sometimes she would sit with Alice and say, "You gave me more years than I expected, my dear, more joy than I thought this heart could still hold." One evening, as spring painted the estate in fresh color, Alice wandered again down to the river. It had been so long since she visited the bend where everything had changed, but something in her called her back. She walked slowly, remembering the cold rush of water, the panic, the weight of the woman she had pulled from the current. And then, the blur of darkness, the sound of a man's voice calling to her, the arms that lifted her from the water, the warmth that followed. Robert found her there, standing near the bank, looking down at the current. "You've been quiet lately," he said gently, coming up behind her. She turned to him, her eyes thoughtful. "I was just remembering. This place, this moment. It was the end of one life and the beginning of another." He took her hand, squeezing it lightly. "Sometimes I still wonder how close we came to never meeting." She nodded. "Or how many times we crossed paths without knowing it." He smiled. "And now here we are, with Clara, with a family." They sat on a nearby bench, carved from stone and warmed by the sun. Birds darted above the water, and the wind stirred the grass in long, lazy ripples. "Do you ever miss the old life?" Robert asked after a moment. Alice thought about the cramped apartment, the cold floors, the hunger, and the long hours spent working jobs that gave no joy. "No," she said, "but I carry it with me. Not the pain of it, but the strength it gave me. It taught me to see what matters. It taught me how to love what's real." He looked at her then, admiration clear in his eyes. "I used to believe I needed to prove something," he said, "to build a name, to reach the top, but you reminded me what all of that was for. It was never about success. It was about finding someone to share it with." They sat in silence for a long while, content in each other's presence. Later that evening, back at the house, the three of them lay together on the wide couch in the parlor. Clara slept between them, her small body nestled in a blanket Eleanor had made. The fire crackled softly, casting golden shadows on the walls. "I think she's dreaming," Robert said, watching Clara's eyelids flutter. "Of what, do you think?" Alice asked with a smile. He shrugged. "Maybe she's flying, or floating on water." Alice chuckled. "Let's hope it's not that." They both grew quiet again, the kind of silence that only comes from knowing there is nothing more important to say than what is already felt. The world outside their windows continued spinning, full of noise, of ambition, of restlessness. But inside their home, there was stillness, a kind of stillness that comes only after a long journey, after the wounds have healed and the heart has been fully, truly seen. Alice closed her eyes and let her head rest on Robert's shoulder. From a girl who had nothing, to a woman who had everything that mattered, not in gold, not in status, but in love and in the people who filled her life. And as sleep slowly claimed them both, she thought of the river once more, not with fear, but with gratitude. For it had taken her once, but it had also given her everything.